It got so crazy that I joked in the office. I was like, maybe one day I'll be an investor again. And then I realized it actually wasn't, as at one point we had 20 houses going at once, which I will never recommend anyone do. It's insane. And that's exactly what it felt like at the moment. It felt insane. The only reason this structure was standing was because it had two solid brick chimneys. If those chimneys were not there, the whole thing would have been gone on. So we tried to very carefully take the siding off. My contractors thought I was insane, and I was like, I know, but just try. And the thing, it literally disintegrated because the termite damage was not just in the sill plate, it had gone up into the siding. What you pay a coach is pennies compared to what they'll save you when you get the right one.
Welcome back to Real Estate Development Land to Legacy.
Real estate development.
This is my first recording after the break. We had nice holidays. Now we're going back into our routines, our daily lives, and trying to figure out how this year is going to turn out. I have an interesting guest today, as always. Mr. Frank Iglesias is joining us from Atlanta. Frank, welcome.
Thank you, Eugene. I appreciate you having me.
Excellent. It's a good day here in Seattle. Perfectly cold and cloudy. It's all good. Let's talk about real estate and development. Tell me a little bit about your background, Frank. What do you do?
Yeah, so I am a real estate investor who fell into this world of development. I was investing for several years. My background before that was music and IT. And then I transitioned into full-time real estate. And after doing it for several years, this thing called new construction showed up on our doorstep. This was back in 2014, I believe, because I was partnered with a lady and we were doing a historic remodel. It was my first historic remodel. And so it was like a lot of things were being learned back then. And someone gave us a deal that was about, hey, and it looked like a flip because everything was a flip to me. And effectively, this person said to me, buy it, fix it, flip it. So we bought it. And then somewhere, and to this day, I don't remember who it was, someone said, well, why don't you knock it down and build it? And it never crossed my mind. And the next thing you know, over the next year and a half or so, we became builders, which then led to buying more land, more houses, learning how surveys work, developing land and all the ups and downs that go through, in particular infill construction in our market, which was Atlanta. So I'm a real estate investor, I'm a builder, and I'm a developer, and it all sort of happened by accident.
I love it. So you made a distinction when you started the introduction. You said you're an investor, but not a developer. Did I hear that correctly?
So I am an investor. It's a great question. So let me clarify. I am an investor first and foremost. When I got into development, my goal was to build as an investment vehicle. We ended up getting so involved in it that we became builders/developers more than we were actual investors. It got so crazy that I joked in the office. I was like, maybe one day I'll be an investor again. And then I realized it actually wasn't a joke. We were running a full-on construction company. And then we realized after doing that for a while, we're like, wait a second. We like new construction, but the goal was not to be a builder developer exclusively. But we sort of became that because of the volume we ended up with. And so we had to shift back to our core of new construction for us as a vehicle. And I've learned how to build a house in my sleep. I've learned a ton about development. We've done things like combining land, separating land, developing land. So we've seen and done all that. But we've also had to get back to our roots of, hey, the goal is development, construction. It's a vehicle. It's not the core of who we are.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it and differentiating it. In my background, we came from construction. My father started a construction company, and we always considered ourselves builders until we got into development. And then, being a developer builder, in the last several years, I realized that I spend majority of my time managing the construction company, and construction company is very intense.
Yeah.
Managing construction company is a very intense process because there's a lot of things happening. And so I can appreciate that distinction because a lot of times people don't necessarily recognize the difference between developer builder and a real estate investor. How do
Yeah,
you, how do you, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just I remember it's like you said, when you're building, there's so much detail. People don't, if you've never done it, like you get it, but people have never done it. They don't realize when you just to build one house, it's like thousands of decisions. It is so intense. Even if you have it all mapped out, there's so many things that can happen and do, right? Classic case would be the weather. One not marking lines, and then the plumber hits your gas line and they shut down the whole street. We had that experience. So thankfully I wasn't there, but my plumber was calling me like, Frank, and I'm like, we called them. I don't know. Right. So they got it all sorted out. It was all good. But, we called 811 and the gas company just never bothered to come mark the line, but they marked it complete. So, you had all this craziness. But on the developer side, what I found was there's a lot less drama. It's much more engineering like. You're working with the surveyors, the engineers, the civil guys, whoever, to really map out. It could be as simple as one lot, it could be a whole subdivision. And it's a really cool but different experience, is what we found, developing versus building. Developing being calmer. Usually, what I found with developing, and interested in your thoughts, is when we developed, it almost became people want to do things the way they want to do it, which was fine. But then when you offer an idea that maybe is, hey, let's look at it this way, sometimes we would have resistance like, well, why would you want to do that? And I'm like, well, why wouldn't we do that? A lot of, well, this is how we always do it kind of thinking. And so sometimes I learned when I developed that the people I worked with, I really needed people to be a little bit more open creativity, because a deal, again, putting my investor hat on, a deal, if I do it the way it maybe quote unquote should be done, the numbers don't work. But if we massage it differently, all of a sudden it's a deal.
Right.
But it'll work, right? And so it's a very fascinating creative side of construction, is what we found.
Yeah, there's definitely pros and cons. The biggest challenge that I found and that I'm trying to educate my clients, my listeners, is that a lot of times people don't appreciate the risks that they are taking when they are developing, and so they're taking money from investors, potentially borrowing money from the bank. They're dealing with municipal challenges, they're dealing with environment, dealing with all these things. But then when they're on the construction side, they have a whole set of other risks, including risks of a major accident and potential death. And you're responsible for people, you're responsible for equipment, things that you don't typically think about when you consider an investment in real estate or new construction. And so that is kind of the first thing that we like to point out, is that yes, you could do both and you could solve many problems by controlling both sides of the equation, but you have to also realize that you're multiplying your risks, and sometimes those risks could be outside of your control, and there may be no solution to them.
Yeah, I agree. It really is two different sets of risks. It really
Yeah,
is.
we also noticed that in construction, because we at some point our company grew fairly large on the construction side. We had about 30 people working, and we're trying to make them interested in the job that they do and have them motivated by the outcome, by building this project the fastest way possible, the least expensive way possible. But contractors a lot of times have different motivation. contractor on its, at its principle is trying to build the stuff for more money because they get more profit, right? Usually their profits are tied to the construction budget.
Mhm.
And in our case, our objective was the opposite. So the challenge for us was, how do we motivate the construction team to do the good job, to lower the price, because they're not incentivized to throw us as many change orders as they can. So, and a lot of times the solution would be, and that's where controlling both sides of the equation helps. The solution is that they may say, okay, well, this change is going to cost you more money, but let's take out, a scope, for example. And like, we're building this apartment building, and they said, let's not do balconies, let's just do Juliet's. It's going to cost you $100,000. Yes, you're going to pay more for, some road improvement that was unforeseen event, but we're going to save some on these balconies. And then the development side runs the numbers and makes that decision. So anyway, I'm talking too much. I wanted to hear more from you, Frank. The transition from flipping to development, how did you find that? Did you find that challenging? Did you find that basically the same thing?
No, so we, of course, when we first got into it, you don't know what you don't know, right? I
Yeah, you
was
think it's
working
easy.
Yeah, right. So I was working with a project manager who also had never built, but she had worked with a lot of remodeling, and she was really good at design work. Like, yeah, she was very good at, and she had done some project management. So she's like, hey, and as I mentioned, someone had suggested, hey, maybe you build this house that we thought we were going to remodel. And then as we looked in, and we took several months, we bought it so cheap that we actually could take a few months to learn about new construction, which was nice, right? It didn't have to be a rush thing. And so after we learned about it, we're like, okay, well, yeah, we could try this. It makes sense. The numbers seem fine. It looks like it'll work. And so we took on this house and we built it. We built our first house and it came out well. It was good. We had some interesting lessons along the way, as there always is in these projects. But, at that point, she was handling a lot of the project management. So it didn't feel super different, but I also wasn't a little later once we started doing some of the management in house with different people, it became really different really quick. And so one of the lessons I learned from my first PM in this space was, again, you don't know what you don't know. So there's no faulting, but there was a number of things she was doing that I just didn't know. Therefore, it just, then when you start doing it, you're like, oh my gosh, they were doing all this stuff and you just didn't know. And then I started realizing there's a lot more to this than goes into flipping. So it gave me a deeper appreciation for it. We ended up building like a bunch of modern homes, farmhouses, bungalows, historic homes. I always smile when I say historic near construction. It always sounds weird, but nevertheless, we did some of that. And, after you do a lot of projects, you realize you're like, gosh, the spec building is such an individualized thing. You could build one in one neighborhood, you go next neighborhood over, a different style, different clientele, different wants. And what we learned is at one point we had 20 houses going at once, which I will never recommend anyone do. It's insane. And that's exactly what it felt like at the moment. It felt insane. But again, we didn't know what we didn't know. So we're just barreling through. And, in retrospect, we learned the value of having a good coach. A good coach. Had I had the coaching at the time we got into this, we would have made some different decisions. We wouldn't have tried to do 20 at once. A lot of the projects came out quite wonderfully. And then a few of them maybe not quite as good, right? It's like anything else. But what we ultimately learned from that experience and builds that have happened since then is new construction and flipping. It's really two different animals. It's two different animals. We use two different calculators. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of not overlap. And so when people say, what's one of the biggest differences, I always say, you got a lot of prep and work that goes into new construction that you just don't have to do when you rehab, unless you're going to do some gargantuan rehab where you're tearing down half the house and rebuilding it 5 times bigger, where it's more of like a hybrid. But typically speaking, most flips are a fraction of the preparation that goes into building. Even if you're just building one house, it's quite a big difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a house in our neighborhood. We walk by it all the time. They stripped it to the studs. They removed the siding. They removed the roofing, all the windows. Like literally, there was nothing left but the studs. And it must have been built, I want to say in the 50s, because like you can see the old framing, like the way it was framed. They don't build it the same way today. But I walked by there and always thinking, what is the reasoning behind doing such a substantial remodel? Like to me, what do you save in the old 50-year-old framing? It doesn't cost that much to reframe the house. I would
Mhm.
just, tear it down and rebuild it. That's my builder brain thinking.
Yeah. It really just depends on what was the acquisition price, what was the budget. Maybe the financing partner was only comfortable with one way and they weren't comfortable. So it may have had nothing to do with the bill. Sometimes the financing people can have a strong opinion on things that can move the direction of the project. Now, is that good or bad can be debatable, but that's another subject, right? There's just so many variables. No doubt some of the things that we uh, have fixed should not have been fixed, but I'll give you an example playing off what you said. It was a house that we remodeled. It was historic, so we couldn't knock it down. It would have been like an act of God to get it done. Um, the only reason this structure was standing was because it had two solid brick chimneys, and they were like one on the left, one on the right. If those chimneys were not there, the whole thing would have been gone on the ground without question. The city said, we have to fix it. The back of the property was open to the elements. Literally, the entire back wall was gone. It wasn't like holes, it was completely gone. We had to rebuild the sill plate on the right side of the house because it was termite ridden. The city said to us, you can do that, but you have to reuse. And we're like,
Old siding.
correct, because they want us, because it's historic. Now, the house was like 3 or 4 feet on either side from the neighboring structure, so you couldn't even see the siding. But in that neighborhood, the historic rules said you got to keep the front and the sides. And this house was a remodel, but it was borderline new construction, similar to what you were describing. So we tried to very carefully take the siding off, and the thing, it literally disintegrated as you pulled it off because the termite damage was not just in the sill plate, it had gone up into the siding as well. This was old
Right.
wood siding. So it ended up being, that whole side of the house ended up being brand new. But that was an example of the house came out great, but budget wise, it was almost the exact same as new construction, but it wasn't
Right.
because we were not allowed to start over, even though logically it 100% should have started over. So, well, we learned a lot. We learned a lot.
Right. Right. I would imagine you probably saved some time because you didn't need to permit the new construction, right? You pulled the remodeling permit, which is typically faster.
It depends on the municipality. In this case, that one I just described was historic. So it really isn't that much faster because of all of those
Yeah.
rules. But
Right.
when
Right.
it's not historic, it depends. In downtown Atlanta, I've seen remodel permits turn in, 30 to 60 days. I've also had one that took 9 months. And it was just a simple remodel with an addition due to staffing issues. And you were talking about risk earlier. That's a risk. Sometimes the municipality's staffing might delay your project, and there's nothing you can do about that unless you want to go hire people for them, right?
Right.
So, that was an interesting thing. And, that's a pretty expensive holdup that you can't do anything about. They're just backlogged, and you're just like, okay.
Right, exactly. Doing 20 houses at the same time was a nightmare. I mean, it's not unheard of. Before we started recording, we mentioned the big companies like the Hortons who are developing hundreds of homes. Anything could be scaled with the right approach, the right staff. But you found that smaller scale is the better approach for you. Is that right?
Yes. And so when we did 20, so just to qualify that a little bit, we were doing 20 spec homes. So all of them were infill in 8 different neighborhoods of Atlanta. And the rules in this neighborhood were different from the rules here. And this one was historic, but this one wasn't. But this one is modern construction. But wait, this one's a farmhouse. So it was just so many variables. And then when we would hire builders, builders would say to us, "Oh yeah, we could manage 5 to 10." And then you found more often than not they couldn't. And so it didn't make sense. But then we learned a very key distinction and why I like doing a little bit less. A key distinction I learned the hard way that no one taught me. Again, having a coach goes a long way, and we didn't have one when we started this, and it hurt. There's different types of builders. The custom builders are different from the spec builders, which are different from the production builders. And we were trying to get production people to do spec. That did not work well at all. It just didn't. We had very poor success with that. The custom guys are great, but they're expensive. Those guys can do anything, right? But you're going to pay them for it, right? Rightfully so. So the big distinction was infill versus production. Once we started working with infill builders, it's like a lot of the problems went away. It just sort of fit because they understood that world. The production people were used to, right? Copy paste, go build 50 of them. Out of 50 houses, you might have 4 or 5 designs, right? Something like that. Everything is mapped out by those developers. Nothing is changing. Whereas in spec, because we bring these production guys in and the problem solving skills we needed simply weren't there because everything was so specialized to that location, that lot, that style, the rules, the neighbors, the whatever for that specific location. Their brains were like, because they were used to everything being pre-planned. And in our case, at least in our city, it's difficult to get everything that detailed planned out for one house because it's just a massive amount of effort. So that was a huge lesson for us. Don't put a square peg in the round hole. It doesn't mean the square peg is wrong, but put the square peg in the square hole, put the round peg in the round hole. Get the right builder for the right project. And I'm a big fan of don't cut any corners, get it right, do it good, high quality job. Buyer comes in, they know it's a good quality project. It's well done. They can be comfortable. Yeah, we're going to warranty it, but the reality is we've had very little warranty callbacks over the years, which has been really good.
Interesting. So, how do you qualify the builders? It's not like they put on their website if they're a production or a spec builder. What questions do you have to ask to know that you're getting involved with the right kind of a contractor? And as I'm assuming we're talking about general contractors.
Yes, yes, yes. So usually the resume will tell you. Usually, if the resume says, for example, "Hey, I'm a builder. I've been a supervisor, builder, whatever title they have with, say, I know, just use Pulte Homes, D.R. Horton, Meritage, some of those people. Back then it sounded great. You're right. It sounded great. And then, it didn't work out. So now I've learned if I see that, that's not the person I want for spec. They might be a great builder. I had a good friend. It was interesting. When I used to teach music, I had a student who became a builder. And I got to chatting with him, I guess it was a year or so ago. And I was like, "Oh, so you got into new construction?" He's like, "Oh, well, his family, he had someone in his family had been in it." And I met him at a production build site where they're building 100 homes, I think it was. But he's like, "Frank actually started in spec." So he actually did both. And he was explaining to me, he's like, "Frank, this is why this is challenging. This is what makes it easy." And he's like, "It's 2 different worlds." It's very hard to live in both worlds because of the nature of the build. So it was just For me, that was a very validating conversation that I wasn't crazy. So he's like, "No, no, no, Brent, you're good. You just had the wrong guy in the wrong job." But, we realize all these guys are good at what they do. You just gotta match the assignment up. And, yeah, back to your question is the resume will tell you. We do our homework on them, right? If they say they've done some spec, okay, great, then we'll talk about that. We'll get some good quality questions about their experience. What are some of the challenges? Maybe even throw out some specific scenarios. How would you handle this? Right? That kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, that's good advice. How does one find a coach for, a specific little niche that they're trying to pursue?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we learned is we really need the first coach to help with business. When I hired my business coach, one of the very first things I learned was, "You're doing how many houses? What are you thinking?" He said it nicely, but that's basically what he was saying.
Right.
You start realizing that fundamentally what we were trying to achieve business-wise, we didn't set it up the best. Not because it was nothing more than we didn't know we didn't know. And so he helped us get a better footing. Like, okay, if you want to go build a bunch of houses, great, but let's make sure these specific business principles are sound before you do that. At this point, we were in it, right? So it was more recovery and fixing than setting up right. But once you've got a good business coach and made sure you've got things set up well, and there's plenty of people out there that teach good business. I mean, business not unique to real estate or construction. Business fundamentals are what they are, right? Sound budgeting, sound accounting, those types of things. Then we look for, I would say, look for investors. If you were doing what I was doing, I would look for an investor who's built new construction and has had success with it, preferably in my own market, or at least a market that's similar. So I'm not going to the Pulte Homes job site looking for somebody because that model is not my model. Okay, it's a great model for those people, but it's not what I do. But I would go find out who are the investors that are building. And so I would look up, and a quick, easy way it is like, who are the builders that build spec homes? Who are they? Who built them? And then dig up their information, call them, find out how many they've done. If they've done it for a long time, might be a great candidate, someone to talk to. Okay. Now, a lot of investors only build one or two houses, and they might be like, that's it, I'm not doing it again, right? So, but I'm going to go looking for people because I've never been to a real estate meeting where there's a bunch of real estate investor builders. Like I've never seen that meeting. It might exist. I've just not seen it, at least not in my market. But I have seen a lot of one-off sales that I can trace back to investor-owned companies. And then so it does take a little homework to find these people, but they're there. They're absolutely there. And then strike up a conversation and see if they're willing to help out.
I mean, in kind of in a roundabout way, this is what a professional developer does. I mean, a lot of times when people call us about helping them develop a property, we don't describe ourselves as coaches, but essentially we take their hand and we guide them through the process.
Yeah.
And I noticed in your bio, you're describing yourself as a coach. So I would imagine this is a type of a service that you also provide.
Yes, with everything we've learned along the way, I definitely do coaching for investors to help them. If you want to flip, great, flip. I'll help you with that. If you want to build, no problem. I can help you with that so that you get it structured the right way. You account for the risks, the variables. Whether you flip or build, one of the things I coach people on is when you're buying the project, you really got to assess risk. When I look at my past, I was like, what I didn't know can and did hurt us. So when I coach people, I'm going to show you, here's all the risks. Here's the targets you need to hit and so forth to make sure before you sign that dotted line that this has a strong chance of success. New construction is not a quick in and out project. It takes a while. And you need to make sure you're reducing risk. So I love coaching people on not just the exciting part of the potential, right? Because we all get excited. Oh, this is going to be a great deal. Or maybe they're not building, maybe they're just going to develop a project and sell the land to a builder.
Right.
But you don't want to be that person. And I had this happen to an architect that I hired once. They did a plan set, submitted it to permitting, but the zoning didn't allow for their plan set. It's a professional architect.
Is that the first thing you start with?
Like I said, you don't know what you don't know. Apparently they were in that boat and somehow they ended up in my boat, but so, I try to coach people on, hey, you really want to think this through. I want you to be excited about your project, but I also want you to be excited about managing risk because it's too expensive of a game to screw up.
I have to ask you, totally unrelated, but I have to know, what instrument do you play?
Oh, percussionist, drummer. Well, I was
Oh,
a
nice.
music major in college, so.
Okay. That's really cool. Yeah, we have a music family. My son's he's 8, but he's taking drum lessons. So
Perfect.
we have a little recording studio here in the house. So yeah, I love music.
Love it. Rock on.
All right. Well, let's see. What else should we talk about?
Yeah, I'll say this. Real estate investing can be very profitable, but it can also be very costly. If you're going to be a business owner, because if you're going to invest in real estate, you're a business owner, whether you do one house or 100, whether you develop one piece of land or 100, you're a business owner. And think of how many professional teams you've seen that don't have coaches. None, they all do. Think about every successful business. Every CEO has a coach. Now, they may not call them a coach, they'll call them the board of directors, right? Different name, but more or less the same purpose. They're not acting in a vacuum. And so I tell people, if you're going to invest in real estate, the mistake I made was for about roughly 2 to 3 years that we didn't have a coach. That's when all the mistakes happen. So whatever you do, have a coach, someone that has seen the highs, but they've also seen the lows, so that they can help you when you make mistakes, because we all will make mistakes, right? No one's immune. And lean on that person and lean on them heavily to help you, because it's truly, what you pay a coach is pennies compared to what they'll save you when you get the right one. So I can't emphasize that enough.
Excellent advice. Get a coach. Make sure that you are bouncing your ideas off of someone who has more experience, and don't forget to ask questions. Frank, it's been a pleasure. What's your contact information? How does one get a hold of you?
Yeah, I'm plastered over all the social media channels. So if you Google my name, you won't have any problem finding me. My website, frankiglesias.com. You can call my office, 678-408-2228. Social media is probably the easiest, just because that's the world we're in now. Friend me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, any of those will be fine.
Thanks for the conversation, Frank.
Real estate development. Real estate development. Land to legacy.
All right. Thank you, Eugene.